Welcome to the Independent Schools podcast with me, Juliet Corbett. I'm absolutely passionate about adapting best practice and research from the business sector to address the real-world challenges being faced by schools. In this podcast, leaders of independent schools will learn actionable tips and strategies to strengthen their school's income streams, be it through fees, fundraising, or commercial ventures. So thanks for joining me today, and let's jump straight in. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Independent School podcast. So we're marking approximately 3 months into this globally life-changing pandemic that we're all experiencing. And I really hope that you and your families and your schools are all well at this moment. What I wanted to talk about this week was we've had 2 weeks of the IDPE live webinars. So for those of you who don't know, IDPE is the Institute for Development Professionals in Education. It's the UK's leading schools development membership organisation. So across the UK, all of the fundraisers, alumni relations professionals and so on in the schools, both independent and state sector, pretty much everyone's a member of IDPE and really benefits from the resources that it produces. So over the last couple of weeks, we've had 2 whole weeks of free webinars and roundtable conversations, and I spoke for one of the webinars. And I think it's been a really useful experience for everybody to get together, if only virtually, and exchange their experiences. The recordings are available to members on the IDPE website. And if you'd like any more information about what they do, you can go to www.idpe.org.uk. What I wanted to do today was to think about some of the themes that have emerged from these 2 weeks of conversations. I mean, there are 101 things happening at the moment across the sector, but I've identified 6 themes of things that are really taking development professionals time and energy to think through and to solve these sorts of problems. So there are 6 key areas. So what I'm going to be doing is I've identified 3 of those that I'd like to look at in this particular podcast. The first is getting your head on board. So this whole piece around internal communications and getting your head and your senior leader on board. Secondly, there's the question of whether to fundraise or not, and it seems to be exercising a lot of thought within the sector, there being absolutely no right answer, but thinking through the ways in which you as a school could decide what's the right approach for you. And the third theme we're going to be talking about in this podcast episode are the innovations in virtual engagement and fundraising that we're seeing in the sector. I've also identified 3 things which I just don't have time to cover today, but which are critically important. And I'm actually going to be doing future podcast episodes on each of these so that we can give them the time and the space they deserve. The first one is the idea of evolving your case for support and making sure that it's really fit for purpose in the current environment. The second theme, which I'm going to be dedicating a whole podcast episode to, is the importance of having a major gifts focus in your fundraising program. And this was something that was important before, but is potentially even more important going forwards. And the third theme, which I'm going to cover in a future episode, is the importance of personal resilience and the way that we can ensure that we are personally best able and capable of coping with the challenges that life is throwing at us at the moment. In some ways, this episode is also a bit of an update on the webinar that I did for IDPE back in early April, the very early days of lockdown. I got some really great feedback from that webinar. Someone said to me, your strategy webinar right at the start of lockdown was a game changer. So helpful to get us off to a good start with regards to our crisis response. I got a load of comments like that, which was absolutely fantastic. And some of the thoughts that I'm sharing with you here are updates on similar things that I was talking about back at the beginning of April. So we're going to be covering 3 themes in this podcast episode: getting your head on board, to fundraise or not to fundraise, and innovations in virtual engagement and fundraising. Now, if you want to have a look at the episode notes, it sets out my 3 key steps that I'm going to give you for each of these themes. So if you go to www.consultjuliet.co.uk/007, you'll find the episode notes. That will be always set out there if you prefer to look at it that way. Okay, so just a quick reminder, this is obviously general advice for all schools. Feel free to contact me for a free video call to talk about the specific challenges you face. The details for that will be at the end of the episode today. Right, so let's think about that first theme, getting your head on board. I noticed throughout the IDPE webinars that quite a lot of times people were reflecting on the fact that their head and the senior leaders in their school just didn't have the time to dedicate to development activities at the moment. Some people were expressing mild frustration at perhaps a lack of understanding, that the senior leaders weren't understanding that fundraising needs to be invested in the long term to produce a sustainable source of income, and that it's a sense that you can stop and start a fundraising department and that it will produce results that are equally good regardless of whether you cut resources or not. I think that underpinning all of this is a really important recognition that heads and senior leaders are going through the most challenging stage of their career. We all are. But they are receiving daily guidance from government about social distancing and ways in which schools need to be operating, health and safety concerns, insurance concerns, keeping parents on board. They have a huge amount on their plates at the moment. So I think some of the frustration that fundraisers are feeling is actually borne out by the fact that heads and senior leaders are really doing the best they can in incredibly difficult circumstances. I mean, we've seen here in the UK, 11 independent schools that I know of that have announced closure, with COVID being a contributing factor, although perhaps not always the only factor in those closures. We will be seeing a lot more, I'm afraid, within the next 12 to 18 months. And so heads really do have a job on their hands. So we need to be making it as easy as possible for them to continue to understand development and to invest in it as much as they are able to within their school finances. So we're also seeing, as a knock-on effect of these financial pressures, significant amount of furloughing. So we're seeing furloughing across the world. Many countries have a furlough scheme in place. In the UK, IDPE combined with Marts and Lundy recently did a survey of schools to see how many schools had had development office staff furloughed. And 66% of the respondents actually said yes, they had had some staff from their development team furloughed. 9% of the total had had their entire team furloughed. So that's nearly 10% of schools surveyed had had their entire team furloughed. So we're talking about quite significant cuts in development capacity at the moment. What is almost certainly true is that as the furloughing schemes wind up across the world, we are likely to see that furloughing pattern reproduced in potential redundancies in our development offices. So it's incredibly important that fundraising leaders can communicate to our school heads and governors the importance of investment in fundraising. So I'd like to outline 3 steps that you can take if you are the most senior fundraiser in your school to communicate to your head and your senior leadership the importance of fundraising. So the first step I'd like to talk to you about, it's all to do with mindset, really. It's about stepping up into a leadership role. Now, regardless of whether you're on the senior management team or not, regardless of your job title, you as the senior fundraiser in your school are the expert which people will be looking to within your community. So you need to communicate your plans with clarity and also with authority. Now, I talk about both of those quite a lot more in the Fundraising Focus Programme Masterclass with regards to internal communications and developing an internal communications plan. So 3 things I talk about in that masterclass are identifying the knowledge objectives that you have for your senior leaders, so the things you need your head and your senior leaders to know, your belief objectives, so the things you need them to really truly believe, and then finally, the behaviour objectives that you have. So what do you actually need them to do in order for you to fulfil your fundraising plans? So that idea of clarity and authority remains very, very important. But I'm going to add to that a 3rd element, which is simplicity. Now, at the moment, if you've had a reduction in staff, you really do need to keep things powerfully simple. This is not the time to be overcomplicating your strategy, especially because during times of crisis, strategy tends to have a much shorter time frame. You can plan a couple of steps ahead, and it's important to do that, but you're not going to be having a lot of advantage if you're trying to plan 15 steps ahead of where you are now, because the world is changing in ways that are completely uncertain. So making sure that you're stepping into a leadership role in which you're communicating with clarity, with authority, and keeping things simple is really important. So that's step number one. Step number two is actually another mindset tool that you can use. And I absolutely loved when I heard this during IDPE for the first time. This is an idea that Laura Firth, the head of development at Bolton School, shared with us. And that's the idea of treating your head like a major donor. And I love this. Major donors, your major prospects, their time is short and you need to cultivate their support. And it's exactly the same as the relationship that you build with your head. You need to cultivate their support over time by slowly building your authority and their confidence in you to steer the ship in a fundraising direction that makes sense. But you also need to put yourself in their shoes and think of it from their perspective and make decisions as easy as possible for them. You wouldn't go to a major donor and present 15 options, all fully costed with huge amounts of detail, and then expect them to make a decision on their own. And you really shouldn't do the same for your head either. You want to present short lists of options with brief descriptions about why you think that's a good route to take, and then have all the detail ready to answer their questions, but not necessarily make it complicated for them. You want to make it as easy as possible for them. So having identified your leadership mindset and your mindset in which you're treating your head like a major donor, then it's time to present your head with the fundraising plan. Now, we're going to talk in a few moments about what that plan might include, but let's assume for the moment that you have a plan. What you want to do is to present to your head either one comprehensive but simple plan as to the way forwards, or at most a plan with a small number of alternatives, but always highlighting your recommended option. You are the professional in this field. Obviously, you need to give your head the opportunity to finesse and to adjust the course that you're suggesting, but it is up to you to present with clarity, authority, a simple plan for going forwards. Make it clear in that plan that things may have to change. We are dealing with extremely high levels of uncertainty, but don't burden them with all of the scenarios that you've thought through and for the reasons for you coming to this recommended option, but be prepared to answer questions around that if they ask you. Make it as easy as possible for them to help you. So set out step-by-step instructions for what you need them to do in order to make this plan work. And be clear about the time frames that you need them to complete those actions within and how long you think those actions will take. If they tell you straight up that you're being overly ambitious in how much time you think they have to put into this, that's fine. It's important that you rethink and renegotiate, if you like, that plan and the potential realistic outcomes in terms of income generation from that plan early on. Don't go into it and then discover later that the head or the senior leaders don't have the time you thought to put into it. Be really clear, straight up, right up at the front. And be really realistic about your income goals. By all means, set amounts for how much you're planning you think you can raise, but be really clear on what the margin for error is in those predictions. And I would say at the moment, it's really hard to predict with certainty how much income you can generate going forwards. So don't tie yourself to really ambitious targets. Be open with them about where you're thinking, the range of income that you can generate, and what may or may not affect your ability to generate that income in terms of the impact on the economy and so on going forwards. And give them a sense of whether you're playing it safe or not, so that they can give you feedback really easily on their tolerance for risk with regards to your fundraising plan. So if you are naturally quite averse to risk, you will probably put forward quite a safe fundraising plan going forward. Make it clear that that's what you've done so that they understand that. Equally, if you're actually feeling quite bullish and feeling quite confident, you're willing to go and take a few risks with regards to your ability to fundraise at the moment, that's fantastic, but be really clear with your head that that is what you're doing in comparison to perhaps the other schools in the sector, again, so that they can have their input and feel that they understand the direction that you're suggesting for the school. And finally, with regards to the plan, make sure that you agree with your head how they want to be updated on your progress. So the frequency of updates and the method in which you're updating them. So that's theme number one, this idea around getting your head on board with fundraising, and the 3 steps I've outlined, 2 to do with mindset. Firstly, getting into a leadership mindset, and secondly, treating your head like a major donor. And then thirdly, the steps you need to take to present your head with a fundraising plan. The second theme I'd like to focus on in this podcast episode is this debate about fundraising or not at the moment. Now, we saw throughout IDPE a number of schools taking really different decisions about whether this is the right time to fundraise or not. Some schools have set up hardship funds or emergency funds, some haven't. Some were already in a fundraising campaign which they've continued, and some weren't in a fundraising mode when COVID pandemic hit. It's not surprising to me that we're seeing schools take different decisions in this area. There is absolutely no right answer. Every school will be in a different situation. They need to make decisions based around the unique situation that they find themselves in. So, for example, factors like whether or not a culture of giving is established at your school will make a difference, whether you're currently in a fundraising campaign or were before COVID-19 or not. And really importantly, the financial need of your school. You may find that your school has said, we have to set up a hardship fund because we can't fund helping parents out in the short term by delaying payment of fees or offering additionally flexible payment plans. But we really need to make sure we have as many pupils in the school as possible come September. And so we need that hardship fund to be as strong as possible to plug that gap. Other schools will say, we've got the financial cushion at the moment to offer some hardship support without having to fundraise for it. So let's hold off for the moment. Let's go into full engagement mode and we'll fundraise again when the time feels right. Both of those are equally valid business plans or business reactions to the situation that your school is in. But what that does do is it makes it quite hard for each school to navigate this question of whether they should be fundraising or not, especially if they and their head have different points of view. So 3 steps that you can take to think about whether or not your school should be fundraising or when you might want to be fundraising. So the first of those 3 steps is reviewing your suite of engagement activity that you've had so far. Now, all schools, whether they're fundraising or not, will have been shifting their engagement programs over the last 3 months to virtual events, email newsletters, different levels of social media activity. A lot of schools have pupils or younger alumni making calls to older, more vulnerable alumni. A lot of schools are doing one-to-one video calls with key prospective donors and so on. So what you can do for step number 1 is to write down on a sheet of paper all of the things that you're currently doing, and for each of those activities, consider it from 2 angles. From the external angle, first of all, what is working to engage people? What is it that people are actually responding to? Which of your virtual events, email newsletters, social media is getting the highest level of engagement? And importantly, which target audience are you engaging with each of those activities? So that's the external point of view. Then you need to think about each of those activities from an internal point of view. So some of those activities will be really quite quick and easy for you to engage in. Others will be potentially very time consuming or difficult for you to engage in. So jotting down your thoughts about where is each activity on that spectrum of quick and easy through to time consuming and hard. Now, the trick here is to try and identify those activities for which you're successfully engaging your key target audiences with relatively quick and easy activities. Those are the ones you want to continue. The ones you want to really question are the activities that are incredibly time consuming and are not necessarily engaging a huge number of people. You could almost plot it on a graph and identify on that graph which are the quick and easy things which are working that you want to continue, which are the time consuming things which aren't really working that you want to discontinue, especially if you currently have staff furloughed and you're operating on a smaller than usual team. So that's the first step, is reviewing your suite of engagement activity. Now, regardless of whether you fundraise or not at the moment, that needs to be rock solid. That engagement is the foundation on which any fundraising will be based now or in the future. The second step is to review or plan your fundraising activities. Now, if you are currently fundraising for either a hardship fund or continuing on a campaign that you were fundraising for before, you want to go through the same kind of review process as I just described for engagement. So that external and internal analysis of what's working so that you can optimize your plans going forwards. If you're not currently fundraising, it's slightly different. You want to prioritize the engagement activities which will strengthen your fundraising in future. Now, there are a couple of different ways you can think about that, but the most obvious one is thinking about your target audience. So whenever you start to fundraise again, the target audience, perhaps for age or career type, for your major donors or for your legacy donors, you want to make sure that you definitely have solid engagement plans for those groups, those target audiences, because that will create a solid foundation for successful fundraising. You also want to make sure that you're engaging specific major donors or prospects that are on your radar. Now, depending on how much time you have, that may be just identifying the top 10 and keeping in touch with them, or it may be a larger number that you're keeping in touch with. But even if you're not fundraising currently, you need to make sure that the relationships with those top prospects, that you're really authentically engaging with them through this COVID-19 pandemic. And the other thing you want to be doing is thinking about the legacy information on your website. There was a really interesting conversation during IDPE Live about legacies and the importance of not necessarily asking at the moment because of the sensitivities around the pandemic, but making it really easy for people to find the information that they want. And just really gently, when the time comes, reminding them that it's possible to leave a legacy to the school. So making sure your legacy information on your website is up to date, is compelling, is appropriate given the current circumstances is another really important thing that you can do to be planning your fundraising going forwards. So step number 1 was reviewing your engagement activities. Step number 2 was reviewing or planning your fundraising activities. Now, step number 3 is going to be for everybody. And this is about looking ahead. Now, we are going to need to be refocusing our case for support continually, I would guess, over the next, I don't know, a couple of years probably, as we move through the different stages of this COVID-19 pandemic. So you need to be able to refocus that case for support by understanding what people want to support and what opportunities there are for your school to respond to the crisis effectively. So I'm going to refer you back to my previous podcast. A couple of episodes ago, I did a podcast called Navigating Fundraising Uncertainty, which was all about using market research techniques to help you generate an information flow, which would create the basis on which you can create your case for support. So I recommend you listen to that if you're doing this at the moment. I'm also going to be doing a future podcast on specifically case for support. So do watch out for that when it comes, and get onto my email mailing list if you don't want to miss it. So that's step number 3. Have a look at those other resources and really think about your case for support going forwards. So those are your 3 steps for making sure your fundraising plan is as robust as possible. Okay, so the third theme that really emerged from IDPE Live for me was all to do with innovations. Now, you won't be surprised to hear that there were many development professionals who were really embracing a spirit of innovative trial and error. We've been forced into it, to be honest, by the current situation. We've been finding really creative ways to engage people through virtual technologies, and also to start fundraising again through virtual technology as well. So we heard a lot of examples of schools trying new things, which were really interesting. Ideas around virtual events like afternoon G&Ts. I love the idea that people can either bring a mug of tea or indeed a gin and tonic. Having lecture series with each of your academic departments giving talks, people doing pub quizzes. Back to school day was a great idea I heard from the Perth School in Cambridge from Erin there. The idea of using your online learning resources that have already been created for your pupils and repurposing them into a back to school day for your alumni. Really creative, really exciting. And of course, as we go forwards, we're going to be having to continually innovate, because even as things open up again, we're going to be looking at hybrid events. So events that have an in-person element, but also a virtual element. The other thing which I noted in my webinar back at the beginning of April, which a number of people mentioned again during this last couple of weeks of IDPE Live, was the fact that people are being very forgiving at the moment. Even if your trial and error new virtual event doesn't go brilliantly, people are really understanding and forgiving if you're trying something new. So we heard Amanda Scott, who's the Director of Development of the Latimer Foundation, talking about this. We also heard Matthew Deere at Arundel School talking about this idea that schools are ultra professional in what we do, which is absolutely a good thing. Most of the schools that I've ever worked with have been very hesitant about doing anything which isn't going to be absolutely perfect on launch. And that attention to detail and that kind of perfectionism is really, really successful in most cases. But what it can do is prevent some of the more exciting strategic innovation that we're seeing across other sectors. So a more creative use of technology, for example. And what schools have had to do over the last 3 months is to ditch the idea that everything is going to be perfect on launch, and instead just jump into something, do your best, be authentic, be empathetic, and it's going to be okay. You're going to learn something from the process, and that is really exciting. And it opens up new possibilities, not just because we're trying to overcome the restrictions around meeting face-to-face, but it actually presents an opportunity to be much more innovative in everything that we're doing. So what I'd like to share with you today are they're not so much 3 steps, as 3 different perspectives you can take in order to make your innovations more strategic. Now, anyone who knows me or has worked with me knows that this is the key thing that I talk about a lot, is about being more strategic. I specialize in working with small development offices where they have a very limited amount of time and limited amount of budget. And so everything that we do has to be so purposeful and strategically thought out to really move things forward in terms of culture of giving, in terms of engagement at our schools. So I'm going to give you 3 perspectives of ways to look at what you're doing now to just review and refresh what we've learned over the last 3 months. Okay, so perspective number 1 is refreshing your view of best practice. Now, it was Jamie Parkins from Just Giving said in his presentation at IDPE Live that it was all about bringing traditional fundraising behaviours online. And I love that idea that we're not throwing out our previous fundraising best practice and starting afresh with a new technology platform. We are bringing all of our knowledge about fundraising best practice onto an online platform. So things like, we know that people give because they feel a connection to the cause, often an emotional connection to a cause. And they want to bring about a transformation in people's lives. That's what underpins all of our case for support and all of our fundraising. Taking your fundraising online doesn't change that. It still needs to be showing how people's lives will be transformed, and it needs to create that emotional connection between the school and the potential donor. So we don't throw away our original best practice, we just evolve it for the online setting. But Jamie at Just Giving also went on to say that we are challenging the norms of fundraising and we need to be brave enough to try something new. And this is this dichotomy that we all find ourselves in at the moment. We want to try something new, but we don't want to throw away the best practice that we were originally basing all of our plans on. So perspective number 1 is to look at everything you've done that's new and just think out, just plot out on a piece of paper, either just yourself or you and your team, in what ways this is still based on the best practice that we know, and in what ways this is breaking new ground. Just being a little bit more intentional about our learning through this pandemic and this process can help us to refresh what we're doing and review the success of what we're doing. Perspective number 2 is thinking about filling skills gaps. Now, this is something that I talked about in my webinar back at the beginning of April, and it's about thinking through what are the skills within your team that you know are lacking? What are the things that you need to get better at? What gaps do you have that you want to fill? Now, things may have changed since the early April, Back then, I don't think we had the furloughing scheme announced yet, or if we had, it was very, very early days. Now, your team is potentially made up of a different combination of staff. And so there may be skills gaps now that you didn't have back before the pandemic that you need to be able to fill in order to be successful going forwards. Things to do with technology are obvious here. So things to do with to what extent you're comfortable with social media, to what extent you're comfortable with online giving platforms, making sure that you're comfortable with video calls and so on. Whatever the gaps are, now is the time to intentionally try those things out. People are still really forgiving, but at some point in the future, that will slowly tail away and people will expect that high level of professionalism again. So trying those things out in the near future could be a really strategic thing to do. So that's filling skill gaps. That's number 2 in terms of the 3 perspectives that I'm encouraging you to use. The third perspective is thinking about technology to improve efficiency. Now, this is something that we could have been talking about a year ago and would have been equally important, but people may have had a low tolerance for adapting to change within your team back then. Having gone through the last 3 months of change, people may be willing to try new things within your team that you haven't considered before. So considering afresh the efficiencies that you can generate within your team through using technology in a more modern way, it's a really great time to be thinking about that, especially if you've got less staff within your office or you've got pressure on budgets going forwards. You need to be getting the most out of your technology choices. So a couple of ideas to get you going here. First one, the obvious one, is going to be your database. So speak to your database provider and see whether or not you're getting the most out of the database. There might be new elements of functionality which have been added at some point in the last couple of years that you haven't necessarily started using. I was speaking to one school recently who only discovered on conversation with their database provider that there was actually a telephone campaign element within the database that she could use for her in-house affinity telephone campaign she's been running recently. The next one is to do with social media. I've been quite surprised actually by how many schools I speak to that aren't making full use of social media scheduling. So this is online software, things like Hootsuite, Later, Buffer. I've just started using one called SmarterQ, which is a small provider, but I've been very impressed with it. These are sometimes free, sometimes paid for social media schedulers. So you can post things at set times over the coming weeks and months. And it's incredibly useful if you're doing weekly posts of archive footage or careers tips or anything like that, which is a kind of a scheduled post. Do get online and make sure you're using something that's really suited to your needs. Similarly, people are now working remotely, and so task management within a team can be important. So you might want to consider looking at some of the task management apps like Trello. I'll link all these in the episode notes so that you can see them there. Another one that I actually love and that I know some schools use is Canva. This is an online design website. So you go onto it, you can have a free version or you can have a paid for version, and you can create really compelling social media posts as well as brochures and all sorts of other things. Now, if you're looking to potentially cut your budget in terms of external design, that could be a way of using technology to boost efficiency and reduce costs. Also things like accounting apps for keeping track of expenses. There are all sorts of things out there. Basically, anything you do regularly, which is time consuming, and where you're thinking, gosh, this is boring, it's probably possible that there is a better or quicker way of doing it using technology. So don't try and change everything at once, but do keep questioning everything. Anything that you or your team are doing, which is a bit of a dull task that happens regularly, ask the question, how can we automate this? How can we use technology to make us more efficient? So those are my 3 themes that came out from the IDPE Live. Now, as I said at the beginning, there are 3 additional trends that I'm going to cover in future podcasts. Looking at adapting your case for support is the first. Looking at major gifts focus and making sure you're spending enough time each week on major gift fundraising is the second. And thirdly, looking at personal resilience. So I'm going to do individual podcast episodes on each of those. So do get onto my email newsletter to make sure you don't miss out. You can go to www.consultjuliet.co.uk/sign up. You can also see the episode notes from today and also explore the other podcast episodes by going to www.consultjuliet.co.uk/007. But the most important thing I want to leave you with was, as with any conference, a virtual conference also gives you an insight into how much everyone else is achieving. And I just wanted to say, don't be daunted when you hear the achievements of others. All schools are in different positions going into this, have different amounts of staffing, different levels of budget, and also will have had a different level of culture of giving within their school at the beginning of this crisis. So don't be disheartened when you hear about the achievements of others, but really try and prioritize your efforts to make sure you're focusing on the things that are actually going to make a difference to your school. So I want you to feel really good about the successes you've had over the last 3 months. You're doing a great job. And especially if you now find yourself the solo fundraiser in your school, I'm reaching out to you and saying you are doing a fantastic job. Keep going. Listen in each week. Do get in touch if you want a free call. Really happy to talk to fundraisers anywhere in the world. I know this can sometimes be a lonely job, and at the moment, perhaps even more so. Just get in touch. Happy to chat anytime. Fantastic. I love spending this time with you. I'll see you again next week. And until then, stay safe. Bye then. So that's it for now, and thanks for listening. Don't forget that you can subscribe to the Independent School Podcast to hear our next episode, or sign up for my regular newsletter at www.consultjuliet.co.uk/sign up. Great. See you next time.